During the latter half of the 2010s, there was an increased interest in the political tradition of democratic socialism and its political proponents, particularly in countries like the United States of America and England. In the USA, this took the form of the rapid growth of the organisation known as the Democratic Socialists of America, or DSA, and the electoral campaign surrounding the self-described Democratic Socialist Senator Bernie Sanders.
Quick point of privilege. Quick point of personal privilege.
Yes.
In England, this interest came about as a result of Jeremy Corbyn, another self-described democratic socialist, with his leadership over the Labour Party and the rise of his supporting political movement, Momentum. However, within the wider context of the tradition of democratic socialism, these two movements are relatively unremarkable apart from the fact that they emerged in developed Western imperialist countries. In fact, there are several so-called democratic socialist parties and organisations which hold governmental power in the world today, such as the Broad Front in Chile, the Liberty and Refoundation Party in Honduras, or even the ruling PDP-Laban Party in the Philippines under the infamously fascistic Rodrigo Duterte. Democratic socialism, whether as a coherent tradition or just a buzzword, is a term that's used by a wide variety of movements across the political spectrum to describe themselves all over the world today. But this begs the question, what is democratic socialism? Where did it come from? Why do these movements refer to themselves as democratic socialists? And more importantly, why isn't democratic socialism enough? Today we're going to take a look at the answers to these questions and more. But first, if you're new here, then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below for bi-weekly Marxist educational content and analysis. If you're in a position to do so and you want to make these videos a weekly thing, then consider tossing a couple of euro or dollar per month over on Patreon so I can pay for an editor to help out. Go on, you know you want to. If you're not in a position to support financially, you can also help out by sharing this video around on social media. Now, in general, democratic socialists are differentiated as a socialist tradition by their committed belief in the use of parliamentary reform to bring about their vision of common ownership. Democratic socialism first appeared as a political ideology through the French Démocrates Socialistes, members of the members of La Montagne, an electoral party in the Second French Republic which formed in the aftermath of the 1848 revolutions. The party took its namesake from the revolutionary Montagne party of Maximilien Robespierre during the First French Republic. Its message was one of a Christian socialist utopia. However, despite its radical rhetoric and clear historical inspiration, this new democratic socialist Montagne would fall far short of the revolutionary standards set by Robespierre's party. Choosing to take the route of pure electoralism and reformism, the party's aim was to come to power through legislative election on a programme of tax cuts. While achieving a sizable portion of the vote in 1849, the party never achieved the victory it predicted, and by the time of the coup d'etat of Napoleon III and the overthrow of the Republic, it was completely powerless. Karl Marx criticised the futility of the democratic socialists' focus on parliamentary methods when he wrote that, if their impotence in Parliament could no longer be doubted, they were entitled now to confine their actions to outbursts of moral indignation and blustering declamation. He even went as far as to describe the new democratic socialist Montagne as a farce in comparison to the original revolutionary Montagne of 1793. Also of note is that the first use of the term social democrat was by Marx in the description of this party. Since then, the use of the terms social democrat and democratic socialist have become almost synonymous, although they're often differentiated nowadays in that social democrats supposedly favour reform of capitalism alone, while democratic socialists proclaim to favour reform of capitalism until a new form of society, socialism, is achieved. What this actually means in practice is, well, unclear, but in general, a democratic socialist is usually considered to be the next step to the left of a social democrat. Despite the failure of the French democratic socialists to achieve state power and create a utopian socialist society, democratic socialism would go on to spread like wildfire throughout Europe and further afield. The Italian Socialist Party was established as a democratic socialist party in 1892. The Socialist Party of America was set up in 1901 and went on to see much growth in the pre-war era under the leadership of Eugene V. Debs. The Labour Party of Britain was founded in 1900 and won seats in the House of Commons in 1902. In 1904, the first true electoral victory by a self-described Democratic Socialist Party took place with the election of Chris Watson in Australia representing the Labour Party in that country. However, despite the lofty promises of democratic socialism, supposedly granting all the benefits of communism with none of the harsh realities of the revolutionary struggle required to actually get there, the first democratic socialist government was a reactionary mess with little to no redeeming socialist qualities. Chris Watson was a devout colonialist and white supremacist, and key supporter and architect of the apartheid policies which would later be known as White Australia. In 1905, Watson passed a new policy in the Australian Labor Party calling for, quote, racial purity in Australia. However, by then the party was already out of power as Watson's government had collapsed within the year. A coloniser, white supremacist, architect of apartheid, and figurehead of a British settler state. And while certainly an extreme example, Chris Watson was a dark forebearer of the future disasters of democratic socialists' attempts at governance to come. The so-called democratic socialists who would take up government in the former half of the 20th century would include names such as the ill-fated Kerensky government in Russia, which, in part due to its hated policy of continuing Russian involvement in the First World War, was ultimately overthrown by the first true workers' revolution on the 7th of November 1917. This would mark the beginning of democratic socialism's true ideological identity, in which it would be defined in opposition to revolutionary Bolshevism, and openly take up the banner of reformism through due process in accordance with the ruling bourgeoisie's standards. Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders have, by all accounts, continued to uphold this democratic socialist tradition of promising to abolish the excesses of capitalism through democratic electoral reforms. However, they also appear to carry with them all the aforementioned problems which have plagued their movement's history. Bernie Sanders in particular broke many a heart when it became clear to his supporters that he was no socialist visionary. As left-wing as his rhetoric had seemed, Sanders proved himself a fervent defender of the American imperialist system. In a 2014 interview, Sanders promised that if elected president, he would support the security of Israel, help Israel fight terrorist attacks against that country, and maintain its independence, thus supporting the American imperialist policy of assisting in the Palestinian genocide by arming the Israeli settler state against the Palestinian people. There's apparently no ideological inconsistency here for democratic socialism. Bernie Sanders is perfectly in line with the likes of Lyndon B. Johnson, the imperialist mass murderer and butcher of Vietnam who, while invading and bombing the people of Vietnam, promised the American working class a bigger share of the imperialist plunder through his Great Society program, which Sanders expressly upholds as an inspiration for his fair deal for the American people. Just as Lyndon B. Johnson would happily bomb Vietnamese children and give a higher share of the profits to the American middle and working class, Bernie Sanders clearly has no qualms with applying the same repugnant logic to the people of Palestine. This, Sanders claims, is the meaning of democratic socialism. I don't believe government should own the means of production, but I do believe that the middle class and the working families who produce the wealth of America deserve a fair deal. Or, to put it more honestly, he believes they deserve a bigger slice of the imperialist pie. Jeremy Corbyn, although less ardently pro-imperialist than Sanders, also has his sympathies towards imperialist heroes of his own. Despite his rhetoric and support for causes such as Palestine, it's important to remember that Corbyn served as the political representative of the pro-imperialist Labour Party, the party which oversaw invasions in Ireland, Korea, Iraq and many others. And of course, in Corbyn's own residence you'll find a bust of former Democratic Socialist Prime Minister Clement Attlee. Considered the first true democratic socialist leader of the British Empire, Attlee is responsible for quaint concessions such as the nationalisation of the postal service. How nice. He's also responsible for the mass imperialist murder by the British Empire in Malaysia during the so-called Malay Emergency, in which the British military forces sprayed herbicides en masse on civilian areas and were responsible for the beheading of civilians. So there's that. Corbyn also sings praises for one of the many English imperialist butchers of Ireland, the Democratic Socialist Prime Minister Harold Wilson, who, while elected on a programme of this democratic socialism, sent British troops to Ireland and oversaw atrocities such as the Bloody Sunday Massacre, an event which Corbyn has often spoke of but failed to mention the role of his own party in. To Corbyn, just like Sanders, it doesn't matter if the wealth was gained through imperialism, only that Wilson made England, in his words, more equal through dishing out fairer shares of the loot and plunder. Likewise, little can be said positively of the democratic socialist experiments in non-imperialist nations. In the oppressed nations, democratic socialism generally either results in a valiant failure, as seen in Chile through the Allende government, or in a completely reactionary, corrupt comprador regime such as the fascist nightmare of Duterte's current administration in the Philippines, which, yes, also proclaims itself to be democratic socialist. Democratic socialist methods have been embraced by revisionist communist parties too, such as the Communist Party of India Marxist, a near completely electoralist and reformist party which attacks the Indian Revolution through deadly militias formed under its local government such as the Kerala Thunderbolts. Needless to say, even in the oppressed nations, democratic socialism has never once succeeded in establishing a socialist state that has been capable of fulfilling its own promises and protecting its gains for the working class from capitalist offensives, whether they be from capitalists at home or from abroad. While the ideals and rhetoric of democratic socialism all seem perfect, and let's be clear, demands such as common ownership, increased democratic power for the working class, and progressive reforms that will eventually lead to a peaceful replacement of capitalism with the new world are far from reactionary at the outset. But it's clear that throughout their history, democratic socialist governments have almost never lived up to any of these promises. Meanwhile, the proponents of democratic socialism appear to be either blissfully unaware of the crimes and errors of democratic socialist governments before them, or even openly endorse them. Democratic socialism is doomed to fail as ultimately, from its conception and since its beginning in France to its current government leadership in Chile, it aims to become the political representative of the bourgeois state, whether as representative of the imperialist bourgeoisie or the comprador bourgeoisie, rather than overthrowing and replacing that capitalist state with the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat to secure genuine working class power. As Lenin stated, everything is illusory except power. And as Mao elaborated, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Without fully dismantling the bourgeois state apparatus and putting in its place new proletarian fighting forces, any gains made by a progressive movement can simply be taken back at any time by the capitalists' armies, police forces, and so on. This fundamental flaw, the complete inability to protect progress, renders it impossible for so-called democratic socialist movements to ever actually advance beyond capitalism and into socialism. So if the democratic will of the people is that a socialist system should be established, then the self-defeating ideology of democratic socialism itself, ironically, becomes an obstacle in the way of the fulfillment of both the democracy and the socialism it supposedly strives for. History hasn't been kind to democratic socialists because of this defect in their theory. While Karl Marx criticised the strategies of democratic socialism in 1852, the formula of their failure hasn't been corrected or evolved in any meaningful way since. To this day, democratic socialists continue to wither away in bourgeois parliaments, hoping to one day become the benevolent chiefs of their respective capitalist state apparatuses. At their best, politically impotent dreamers. At their worst, fascistic servants of imperialism. The supposedly radical reputations of democratic socialists come largely from their opponents. Corbyn and Sanders, for example, are often derided as communists or revolutionaries. Meanwhile, both preach blunt messages of due process and careful reform, ultimately playing by the rules of the bourgeoisie which have been designed specifically to protect bourgeois class relations. As Marx pointed out when speaking of those original French democratic socialists, when the red spectre continually conjured up and exercised by the counter-revolutionaries finally appears, it appears not with the Phrygian cap of anarchy on its head, but in the uniform of order in red breeches. The theory of democratic socialism has dismantled countless progressive movements, either from the outside, such as with the destruction of the Spartacus uprising by the German Social Democrats, or from within, such as through the rapid internal degeneration of the Irish Labour Party. In all cases, democratic socialism consistently pushes the left to the defanged, futile, reformist path of order in red breeches. Ultimately, the path of capitalism under a red flag. There's a quote that's often misattributed to Albert Einstein which states that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Regardless of who actually said this, the history of the democratic socialist movement shows that it has never and will never be a viable path to any kind of genuine liberation from the chains of the capitalist imperialist system. In contrast to this, scientific socialists test their theory through practice in the laboratory of class struggle. Where there's success, we build on this and move forward, such as from the examples of the successes of the Bolshevik Revolution and the Chinese Revolution. Where there's failure, we don't simply try the same old failed strategies over and over again until they magically bring about the utopian visions that we've conjured up in our minds and hope to impose upon reality. But we instead discard the methods which have failed to advance the working class movement in material reality, including the democratic socialist project. While many democratic socialists come from places of good faith and sincerely progressive intentions, it's important to help these comrades realise that their vision for a better future that's both democratic and socialist can't be realised through the confines of this utopian ideology which has failed time and time again. Those who seek to genuinely advance the working class and oppressed masses towards complete liberation from the tyranny of class society must come to realise that our only hope lies in the sole course which throughout history has shown any real, meaningful, lasting success. The revolutionary path based on Marxist scientific socialism. Right, thanks very much for watching this video. Hopefully you found it useful in one way or another. It should go without saying that this video isn't a criticism of democracy or socialism that is democratic in any way. In fact, I'd argue that modern revolutionary socialism is far more deeply democratic than anything hitherto even conceivable under bourgeois society. Especially with the advances made by Marxism, Leninism, Maoism like the mass line and cultural revolution, but also its deeper understanding of the party and democratic centralism, line struggle, the continuation of class struggle until class society itself has been abolished, even if that means the people rising up against the Communist Party itself, bombarding the party headquarters as we say, and so on and so forth. For more on this, I recommend checking out the Politics in Command channel, particularly the video Mass Line, the Communist Method of Leadership, which you'll find linked in the description box below. As always, thank you to the relentlessly enduring supporters on Patreon who continue to make these videos possible. Literally. Thank you Blue Collar Red, Julia Affentranger, Ukopnik, Ian Snyder, Jacob Jaff, Grimwater, Borku Gorilla, Ryan Hodson, Soup, Michaela Schmid, Kristen Napales, Alfonso Dingo Torres, Rod Cardist, Zakasi, Anglo-Irish Bolshevik, Thomas Ross and Wood, Bobby Block, Jason Schmidt, Mitch Schiller, Saoirse Velan, Roja, MLM in Practice, Eric Lindahl, Robert Jarzak, Pastor Schubert, Miss Miyamoto, Anastasia, Wonderbad, JT Chapman, Joseph Shepard, Comrade Amara, Weltfitter 99%, Peter Krause, and Hagen Mitchells. Cheers everyone, agus slán go fóill.